Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast today on the 8th of September, 2018.
You profit from fear and hate, hoarding wealth and amassing power. The walls have been unleashed. We will not submit or cower. It's humanity's darkest side. We are ruled by thieves and liars.
So, the first story that I have here today is, well, I guess before I get into it, I'll just say I haven't finished up my next episode of Know Your Owners yet. I'm still working on it, but I'm not sure when that's going to be up. But, so I'm just going to go through a few of the things that are going on right now, a few of the stories in the news. And the first one that I want to talk to everyone about, it has some importance to me personally. And I think people may know by now that a gentleman that I've had on my podcast before, he was my very first interviewee, I guess. He was my very first person to give me an interview for my podcast. His name is Professor Rick Mehta. Rick Mehta, actually. I think I've always pronounced his last name Mehta, though. He back in January of 2018, he granted me an interview, and this was after he got into a little bit of a spat with his university and a little bit of trouble online. It was because he was criticizing conservative leader Andrew Scheer, because Scheer talks about how he is supposed to be pro-free speech, but then he ended up removing one of the conservative senators from the caucus. Senator Bayak, if I'm remembering correctly, it was her name, because of some controversial stuff she had up on her website. And so Mehta wasn't actually defending the senator herself, but he was more just talking about how Scheer is supposed to be standing up for these principles, but then he's backing down on them, something that I've talked about before that I have a problem with. And I just have a quick snippet here of my time talking to Professor Mehta.
Yeah, I guess start to get people talking. So I know there are people on campus, let's say amongst faculty, who might agree with me or support me, but they're self-censoring, so that doesn't help. So that allows the ones who want to exert control to have their own way. And ultimately, all they do is call you names at the end of the day because they don't have any arguments. So, but I guess others are just afraid of the name calling and the harassment.
I've also noticed that even when the name calling and the harassment isn't enough, I saw the tweet even myself that some people are even now are trying to do a call to action against you. There was one person I saw who was saying words are useless on you or something along those lines.
Well, I have tweeted a few times that every insult I receive is a badge of honor. So
I definitely see that.
So I take, so I just kind of, I just try to take their weapons away from them. So the downside of that, though, I wonder if there is that risk that they'll use real weapons. But yeah, because there was one person who had threatened to hit me with his grandmother's iron skillet. And I reported that, but nothing happened. And kind of get the Twitter report saying, oh, well, context matters.
So that was just a snippet of my interview with Professor Mehta from a few months ago, and anybody who hasn't seen it, I'd highly recommend you go check it out. It was Mehta himself is a very intelligent man, and he's definitely one of the, in my point of view, he is one of the best people out there, one of the best warriors when it comes to free speech, and it's a very important quality to him. So he stands up for it, and I've actually seen Professor Mehta do this, not just for people that he supports and people and points of view that he likes, but he actually is a true free speech warrior, because he also has he's also defended people whose points of view he doesn't agree with, but he has talked about how they should have a right to be able to express their point of views. However, the reason that I bring up the Professor Mehta right now is because it was just released a little while ago. I only came across this last night, and I didn't have an opportunity to post a video about it, so I decided that today I would take the time. Is that Professor Mehta has been fired by Acadia University. he has faced a lot of he's been facing a lot of flashback from both the students, faculty, for a lot of things that he's discussed there, and he was put underneath investigation a few months ago by the school. Well, it's been official that as of October 31st, Professor Mehta is no longer a member of the faculty staff at the University of Acadia. Now, he was telling me when we spoke about how how Acadia is a very left-wing university. I mean, many of them are these days. We're seeing constant problems and hearing constant stories that are coming out of a lot of these universities, both in Canada and America. And so he was one of those people there that was trying to make a difference and was trying to he was trying to present to his students another line of thinking, the opposite end of the argument, but this got him into trouble time and time again. So as this goes on, it says, to say, Acadia University psychology professor Rick Mehta has been fired 6 months after the school launched an investigation over allegedly racist and transphobic comments. The school said it was legally obligated to investigate in order to provide an environment free of harassment and discrimination. Well, as we kind of saw here, there at the end of when I was talking to the professor, from that clip that I just showed, he himself had been had some threats put against him, but those were not being investigated neither by the school or by, well, I guess in that case he was talking about Twitter. But the point is that when he was not granted any of the same sort of he was not granted remotely close to the same amount of consideration that other people were, that a lot of these students were. And the thing is, we have problems right now with some teachers out there right now. I mean, we have a bunch of teachers that are threatening to, for instance, in Ontario, we have the sex ed curriculum that was rolled back, and some teachers are still threatening to say, well, we'll teach the updated version regardless. They can't really do that. There's some problems there because of legality issues. But here is just a man who is supposed to be given leeway in what he teaches, because he teaches in a university. He teaches about psychology. You can't just and the thing about psychology is you got to learn about the way people think, and you can't just do that if you're only presenting them to one side of the argument. If you're trying to present to them a really politically correct point of view, you need to branch out, you need to show them everything, and you need to get them thinking outside the box. This is something that's very important if you're dealing with the subject of psychology, is being able to think outside the box and being able to understand the way other people think as well. So, and he's supposed to be given this leeway in order to teach, but then he's constantly felt that he has been suppressed, that he can't teach the kids what they're supposed to, because if he does, he gets into trouble with the university, and the fact that he just got fired is proof of that. So we have that problem there, and the thing is, too, is universities are supposed to foster this idea of teaching kids the importance of it's to teach kids the importance of knowing of different points of view. When I actually, a few months ago, I ended up putting the audio up on my channel as well, and people can go check it out. It was a panel that was in Ottawa that I ended up going to, and that one did feature Professor Mehta. It also had Lindsay Shepard on there, who was from the Laurier incident, and there was another man there who taught. His name was Henry Beisel, and one thing that he said about it when he's talking about when he was in class one time, this gentleman, Henry Beisel, who I got his card here. I should invite him on the podcast, actually. He ended up saying about how one time when he was teaching some of his students, one of his students came up to him afterwards and said, like, what you said made me feel uncomfortable. And as he responded, he says, it's my job to make you feel uncomfortable. This is the point of what teachers are supposed to do, more specifically, not just in our public schools, elementary school, high schools, but in university and college. This is the area where the teachers should be teaching them the different point of views, teaching them how to think critically, how to think differently. But this isn't the case anymore. And it's really unfortunate. And as far as I can tell, when I'm looking through this article about Professor Mehta, there's a lot that we're not being told by the university as to why they're fired, and they refuse to provide details of what Professor Mehta has said, what he's done in order to warrant this firing. As it says here, we have a brief statement from the Acadia University about his firing. It says, quote, "We can confirm that Dr. Rick Mehta, a professor in Acadia University Department of Psychology, has been dismissed by the university. As this is a personal matter, the university will provide no additional comments or respond to requests for further details," end quote, an unnamed school spokesperson said in a Facebook message. So they're going to fire him, and Professor Mehta is a public figure by this point for his outspokenness and the fact that they've had to write articles on him. You can go back and you can find him articles that have been written on him by now. So the fact that he's a public figure and they're not going to provide any more statements or responses is a very concerning thing to do. The other thing is too is the fact that the other thing is, too, with this whole situation is the fact that they are refusing to provide any sort of details because, in my opinion, they don't really have much. He may have said some things that are controversial, but it's not nearly to the degree that they are trying to present it as. They're trying to make him seem like he is a hateful, bigoted person when all he's doing is trying to foster a free speech attitude in the universities. This is something that we have a problem with. Andrew Scheer a while back said that he would cut federal funding to universities that didn't sponsor a free speech attitude. And even Doug Ford right now, Premier of Ontario, he's a person that is also doing that. Very recently, he announced that schools have to adopt a free speech point of view, a free speech attitude. Otherwise, they're going to have federal funds cut from them. And I actually think it's a good idea because right now, these universities are indoctrination into left-wing policies. Now, this has to do with the idea, one of the reasons that we have so much of a left-wing political point of view in universities and schools. It does a little bit have to do with the fact that people who go into this sort of line of work generally end up more in a more liberal point of view, a more liberal political view, but it also has to do with the idea of the long march through the institutions which took place. And this is a number of documents that have been placed by this. There's also an interview with a man called Yuri Bezmenov, and Yuri Bezmenov used to be a Soviet asset before he ended up coming to the West, and he started talking about all these problems that are going on in things such as schools. And one thing he was talking about is how the idea was to send people in and get them into the school system, get them into being professors and in other positions, and then influence the next generation or next couple generations in order to have a more left-wing point of view and pretty much gravitate more towards socialism and communism. That was actually the plan of the Long March through the institutions, and we're seeing this now. We see it manifest itself in, for instance, when we look into the United States, we have Antifa, and a number of professors are part of Antifa, this radical violent group that is so committed to left-wing policies that they are calling anybody right now a Nazi. And that's a pretty extreme point of view to have, to call someone a Nazi. But these are not necessarily Nazis. I mean, even Antifa themselves have put out the slogan that liberals get the bullet too. They see liberals as too far to the right than them. Pretty much anybody to the right of them is wrong and needs to be fought back against. And it doesn't matter whether these people actually fall into a political line, and it doesn't matter if these people are apolitical or deeply involved in politics, because we've seen plenty of times when Antifa will attack people on the streets, and these are just civilians. We don't know. They could be more in line with Antifa's point of view, but they attack them on the streets. So this is why we have a much more left-wing bias right now in universities, and this is even backed up by a number of polls that have been done, and there's hard data out there which show that so many of the teachers end up falling in on a more liberal and left-wing political point of view. In fact, these days, I would say that when you're talking about the far left, there's much more of those than just strictly liberal professors out there these days. So this is part of the problem, and that it's only, depending where you go, sometimes it's only 1 in 10 or worse of professors that end up having a more conservative point of view. But this is not the way to do in order to teach people. You need to have people that are learning one wing of politics and the other wing of politics. According to Mehta, the firing came from Acadia President Peter Ricketts, citing issues that were wide-ranging and include failure to fulfill academic responsibilities, unprofessional conduct, breach of privacy, and harassment and intimidation of students and other members of the university community. Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how he could be an intimidating person and a harasser when all he's doing is he's trying to present a different point of view, as I've already stated several different times. In fact, as he's stated both on his Twitter account, he stated in interviews, he stated it with me when we spoke, is that he's actually been on the receiving end of a lot of harassment and even threats. I remember that after I did an interview with Professor Mehta back in January, we both kind of got into it a little bit with this guy on Twitter. He actually originally went after Professor Mehta, and I jumped in because I felt the fact that I invited Mehta onto my podcast, he should not be the one bearing the brunt of this sort of attack. So I tried to jump in and sort of steer it my way, which ended up happening. Me and the guy ended up going back and forth. And that as long as this guy hasn't deleted his tweets, they're still up and available for anybody to check on my Twitter account. You can go back, it'd be roughly around January 15th or something around there of this year, so you can go and see it. But the guy that we were interacting with literally was wearing an Antifa hat. And Professor Mehta also talked about how he received like a bunch of threats online. Some of them were people who were relatively close to where he lived. So it was a very real possibility of him being attacked or something like that. I don't know what's going on upstairs right now. I'm sure everybody heard that crash for a second. Let's see. Mehta says his letter from Ricketts speaks only in generalities and does not lay out specific examples of misconduct. The termination was based on 2 reports commissioned by the school. One by law professor Wayne McKay and the other by Dean of Science Jeff Hooper. Now, I thought this was a little interesting when I ended up looking into this, is that the 2 people who have done this are, first of all, they're members of the school. These aren't students who are doing this, who issued these 2 reports. But this is the law professor and also the Dean of Science. I don't know, perhaps the psychology department falls underneath the science department, but it's like a soft science, these sort of things, when it comes to psychology, therapy, and that. It's not really part of the hard sciences. So I find this interesting that these were the ones who commissioned these reports out of him. It's the Dean of Science and a law professor. Very interesting. And on top of this, it turns out that I think just below actually it talks about this. Mehta says he's unable to have copies of these reports unless he agrees to be broadly gagged. So they would require him to not discuss any of this right now. Now, I wonder why. It's because if he was discussed this and actually put it up to the public in order to see, they probably would see that this was not, these reports were not backed by a lot of facts. They weren't backed by a lot of evidence, and that in the long run, this action against Professor Mehta is actually unwarranted. But he is fighting this right now. His union that he's a part of is filed for an arbitration to fight the firing, so it's possible that he could get his job back. Now, I have already last night I shot out a message just on Twitter, and I think I'm going to send an actual DM to Professor Mehta just to sort of hope that he's doing well. And I've told him that he's allowed, if he needs an outlet to discuss these sort of things, he's allowed back onto my podcast anytime he wants. And hell, he's allowed even if it doesn't have situations like this. He's just allowed in and of itself because he was a very interesting man to talk to. But I think he's taken some time to himself at the moment. He was a little active in the morning on Twitter, and it doesn't look like he's really posted anything since then. So I think he's just taken some time with everything that's happened to himself. But some of the stuff that he did retweet had to do with his firing. So he was informing people to do this. This was the only thing also that yesterday, until I actually saw that he himself had retweeted some of these articles about him getting fired, I was a little skeptical to jump on because I wasn't sure how widespread it was. But even he's talking about it. He's also changed on his Twitter. He's changed his account from saying a professor of psychology, University of Acadia. He's changed it to a former professor now. So he seems to be pretty open about this whole situation. I hope that he can be willing to come on if he needs an outlet. I will be happy to provide him that. But the thing is, too, is this is going back a little bit, and I think I showed this months ago. But there were petitions that were put up on change.org. One was a petition against Professor Mehta in order to get him fired. The second was a petition in support of Professor Mehta. And the same thing happened back then as has happened right now. Yeah, you can still see, okay. So this is the petition to have Professor Mehta fired from the university, from teaching. So as we can see here, right now, there is 1,969 people who have signed it, and they want to get to 2,500. So this is the one that is against him right now, and they're stating all sorts of things, such as he's against trans rights, believes residential schools did good, and believes that the indigenous industry are exploiting Western values of justice. These are all things that are getting blown out of proportion, because this here states that was a retweet. This is something that Professor Mehta put out. It says, it's statistically impossible for all Native children who have had a negative experience with residential schools. To deny this fact would be just as bad as denying that the majority that did have negative experiences. Truth is truth. He never said that in this one. He's not saying that the residential schools did good. What he was saying is that not every single not every single Native person inside of these schools had a bad experience. And this actually was backed up by a government report. I'm trying to remember it right now. It was called, I think it was called the Reservation in Indian Act from 1946 to 1970, if I'm remembering correctly. We actually touched on it in our very first interview with him. He ends up talking about how I showed it to him, and in one section it was talking about one of the problems they had with closing down residential schools was that a number of Native parents actually wanted their kids to go to the residential schools. This would be because for a few different reasons. They'd be getting an education that they wouldn't necessarily be able to get without the residential schools, because not all of these could teach there weren't schools widely available for the Native people. Also had to do with that in these schools, they'd be giving them a warm place to stay, clean clothes, 3 meals a day. Now, we have heard plenty of bad shit that happened in these schools at the time. We had something about 6,000 kids that went from the residential schools and ended up dying. Whether that's from abuse, neglect, or any of those is still unclear. Some of it might be from diseases. And there was sexual abuse, and there were ways that the kids were harassed and abused in other ways. It's not like bad things didn't happen. It did happen. But he's just trying to give a much more realistic point of view on these on the residential schools. And the reason I brought this up is that we have 1,969 people who have signed this petition. But if we go over the petition that is in support of Professor Mehta, we have 3,149 people who have signed out of 5,000. This one not only has, not quite double, but it's getting close to doubling the amount of people who wanted Professor Mehta removed. It actually, not only that, but it's even past what would have been the number that they're looking for on the one to get Professor Mehta removed, because it was 2,500 looking for. We have over 3,000s on this one. So clearly there's a number of people out there who support him and want him to be able to continue to teach, because they understand that this is just people who are ingrained in their political point of view, ingrained with the idea ingrained in the idea that as you do any sort of thing, if you say anything that's controversial, that immediately means you're a bigot and an asshole. But this is not the situation with Professor Mehta. I've talked to him. I've spoken to him on that interview. I've spoken to him several times since then through interacting on Twitter. I even spoke to him in person when he came to that rally in Ottawa. This is not the man that they're painting it to be. But he's not getting much support from anybody from the university. He's really just his people who he knows online that are trying to show support. And I hope that other professors out there who speak out about this will be willing to come forward in defense of him. Perhaps Professor Gad Saad, the Gadfather, and maybe even someone like Jordan Peterson could come to the defense of Professor Mehta. I would love to see Professor Mehta speak to Jordan Peterson, because Peterson on his YouTube channel has these has this where he talks to other professors about the problems that are facing universities and the problems they face in universities. So I'm really hoping to see that these people step up and are willing to show him the support that he deserves. But this is what we're at right now in Professor Mehta, is they're trying to destroy his life simply because he's outspoken and he's an advocate for free speech. And the thing is that I have a lot of respect for Professor Mehta, is despite everything he's going through, he stuck to his guns. He stuck to his principles. I mean, right now we have that Colin Kaepernick Nike ad about, it's like believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. But this is really a man here who did believe in something and did sacrifice everything in order to stand up for his own principles. And you know what? I think I'm going to make that the thumbnail for this video. So everybody who's out there, I highly recommend that you sign this petition in support for Professor Mehta. Go, if you have a Twitter account or Facebook, go on and shoot him a quick message of support. I think he'll really appreciate it, and hopefully that he can fight back and get his job back if he wants it back. At this, you never know. Maybe he'll, even if he's told by, even if the union is successful and he manages to get his job back, it's possible he may not want it. But I hope that he's able to. I hope that Professor Mehta is really able to get his job back and fight back against this slanderous, at least that's what my opinion, I consider it a slanderous thing to do, by firing him over reports and details that are inconclusive at best. At best, they're inconclusive. It's just a shame. It's a shame when we get to these points in our society. All right. So I think in one of my, really the last video that I did, like more along these lines that I really put out, I kind of did a live stream a little while ago about what the future holds. But I think the last video I really was kind of talking about some of the situations involving politics these days had to do with the split between Andrew Scheer and Maxime Bernier, and that's been heating up a lot. We've been having at first Maxime Bernier was very much on the end of criticism from a lot of people, and a lot of people still do, of course, but I find that people who are more involved in this sort of activity, the YouTubers, the younger people who are involved in politics these days and who support the Conservative Party, they seem to be going with Maxime Bernier, with what he wants to do with his new party. Now, we still have, as far as I know, I don't think I've heard the name of his new party yet, but we'll end up seeing what ends up happening with that. But it's very interesting because Maxime Bernier is receiving a lot of support online. People are now on Twitter changing their Twitter handle to say #BernierNation, and this is in solidarity with him. But he has also apparently gained a lot of support from from all sides, from all political parties. People were criticizing him at first because none of his Conservative caucus members ended up going along with them. Now this seems to have changed, and there are some who are in negotiation, it seems, with Andrew Scheer, and these are sitting MPs. He's already gained something like 13% of support. It might even be higher now. I think last time I saw it, it was about 17% of the popular vote right now likes Andrew Scheer, Maxime Bernier. And he hasn't even announced his party yet, but he's starting to talk about things even more now since he left that a lot of Canadians want. And one thing too that I find that this has done with Maxime Bernier leaving is it showed the true colors of a lot of Conservative members of Parliament, and even when we're talking about some in provincial Parliament too, it shows their true colors as to who they are and what they believe in. It has to do with some engagement online, and probably the one that has been most it was one MP who had a lot of people support her. Now she really seems to be split down the middle. You either support her and like her, or you don't support her and don't like her very much. This MP is Michelle Rempel. Now this is mostly due because some well-known conservative YouTubers ended up sort of engaging with her over the last few days. I think this probably, you can go back at most half a week. And so this included Derek Rance, this included Frank Vaughn, this includes Steeper33. Steeper33 is pretty well known now. He's just for clipping the news, clipping scenes from Parliament and posting them online. These are all people that support Maxime Bernier. But when Michelle Rempel was getting challenged on some of her ideas when it comes to immigration and some of the ideas of Andrew Scheer, she descended into character that could only, we could say, is only fit for a leftist. She ended up not answering questions, deflecting, got very salty, very insulting, and it was not a good look for her. A lot of people saw this and ended up just calling her out for it. It's not that great, to be in my opinion. So I have here, this is some screen caps of Michelle Rempel with some of her engagements with Frank Vaughan and a few others that she was talking about. So we can take a look through. How clear is it on your end? It looks pretty clear, right? Okay. Just making sure that it can be seen because it's not very big right now. Hold on, actually. How's that? A little bit better. So, Michelle Rempel, and I don't know if this is backed up by facts, but I've heard that Michelle Rempel is one of the members of parliament who's actually blocked the most people online. Now, for her, I'm pretty sure she'll talk about how it has to do with harassment and this, that, and the other. But she's also been one of those candidates that has called the Trudeau government out for using identity politics, for using all sorts of language that is supposed to be divisive. But I personally have seen her guilty of this too. I remember a while ago, one thing that kind of stood out to me was that while the Conservatives are kind of pissed off with the way that Trudeau goes about stuff with his gender diverse cabinet, they're just seeing it, they're more supposed to be about merit-based, the Conservatives. Michelle Rempel herself, who has called Trudeau's government out for this, has been guilty of this sort of thing. A while ago, she ended up posting a picture of a number of Conservative interns that were all women online and started giving praise that those were the new interns and that a call to action for women to get involved in politics. Some people called her out on it, be like, well, it shouldn't just be women, you should be calling more about just people to get involved and not fall into what the Trudeau camp. Of course, she got defensive at this and started talking about the number of women in politics and how it's a problem. We need more women. The thing is, though, is you can't force them into these positions. This is sort of my beef whenever people talk about it's like we need more women in this or we need more minorities here or there or whatever. It's just you can't force these people into doing something that they don't want to do. This has actually been my biggest problem when we're talking about, they say, when Trudeau said a couple of years ago that by the year 2020, I think they said, they wanted 25% of the military to be women. Well, if they don't have interest in these jobs, then how are you going to get them in there short of forcing them in? But she got defensive about this. She's been defensive in the past when people have criticized her for something, and a lot of times she jumps back on the fact that she's a woman in politics. She's not the only one. I've seen Lisa MacLeod do this, and I've called out Lisa MacLeod a couple times about that. I've seen Lisa Raitt do this as well. Lisa MacLeod is a part of Ontario provincial government, while Michelle Rempel, Lisa Raitt are part of the federal Conservative Party. So we have here when she's talking about some of the things that she said, and we have, for instance, she's talking about blocking people often if they're giving you a hard time. So that's a censorship, and a lot of people say it's unconstitutional for a member of parliament to block somebody online, such as this, because they're a public figure. They've been elected into office by the people, so now they should be able to interact with people. This is actually something that also went down in America recently, because they were saying, well, President Trump shouldn't be able to block people. And I actually agree with this. Is that especially if you're using your Twitter account or Facebook account to advertise for yourself as a member of parliament, then I completely agree that that these politicians should not have the ability to block people. Ignore them as much as you want, but to actually block them so they can't interact with you, that seems a little sketchy, especially if you're a politician that's supposed to be against censorship and pro-free speech. And then we have, she did this many times throughout the thing, throughout her interactions, is she called, especially Frank Vaughan, she ended up calling him a liberal bot, and that's talking about how he was just like Justin Trudeau, or at least at some points, if he supported Trudeau. We have over here where she says, where she's calling Frank Vaughn sad, beta, and a couple other things. Well, how would she react if she was a woman, and as a woman, if somebody came on and was trying to sort of discredit her based on her gender as well? Because this is what she's doing when she's talking about Frank Vaughn being a beta male. And it's just so she would be one who talks about sexism in politics. There's her using sexist name calling. Down here it says, do you even know what that is, or do you need to Google it? Immigration system expert. And it's again, she's getting condescending. Now, Frank Vaughn was a card-carrying member of the Conservative Party. In fact, after Bernier, with everything that happened with Bernier, he went on his podcast, the Frank Vaughn podcast, and he ended up chopping up his card symbolically. But since then he's called to actually cancel his membership. So, because he's very upset with the way things went with Bernier and the way at the Halifax. I think the thing for him that was a tipping point was the Halifax Policy Convention, is that because we heard certain things about how they were suppressing votes and how Andrew Scheer was going to veto any sort of action against supply management, regardless of even if it had popular support to end it. So then we have, and then she once again calls him a liberal bot account. These are just sort of the interactions that she's been having, and she wasn't just restricted to Frank Vaughn. It was also many other people who were engaging in this, engaging with her, that she ended up calling these sort of names to. So this sort of name calling is definitely much more along the lines of the Trudeau government and the Liberals and what they do, and more left-wing of politics. But these are supposed to be conservative members of Parliament, so they're just showing who they truly are. And this goes along more with what I've talked about in the past about Andrew Scheer not standing up for his principles. And I mean, what happened at the beginning of this year with Professor Mehta speaking out against Andrew Scheer because of getting rid of Lynn Bayak was the senator's name. That was not him standing up for free speech. He backbenched Bernier because of what Bernier has done, not giving him a right to speak his mind. And he's also even silenced a lot of constituents involved in their politics. So it's just even the Conservative Party themselves. I think the Conservatives are still more understand what the Canadian people want, but all in all, they're still pretty disconnected with the average Canadian out there, and a lot of their policies do line up with the Trudeau governments. I mean, one thing that she received criticism for, and she was very defensive of, or we're talking about Michelle Rempel again. One thing that she was very critical, very defensive of, had to do with her immigration policy. And what it was is that everybody who's illegally crossed our border now at Roxham Road and all over, is that they're not going to send them back, even though they are illegal immigrants, but they're going to try and plug the holes so that way that the people can't keep crossing. But everybody who's here is more or less going to give a pathway to citizenship. This doesn't sit well with a lot of Canadians, because these are people who cross the border illegally, are now free to move around Canada, take access of taxpayer-funded services such as medical. They are having their free housing given to them, which is causing a housing crisis to the point where we're putting these refugees. We're putting them up in hotel rooms, and we've heard a number of damage that has been coming out of the hotels because of that. And I wouldn't be surprised that if the violence that is happening in Toronto, it's not necessarily just because people are crossing the border, but we don't know who is crossing the border. So it seems very likely that we would even have some people who would be criminals and easily engage in those sort of activities. But all that the Conservatives are going to do with their immigration plan is try and plug the hole, which, yeah, that's good. You want to plug the hole. But you're then just going to let everybody stay, take advantage of the system, and they haven't paid any taxes into anything. It's absolutely fucking ridiculous. I mean, we even heard recently that a couple of stories that I've heard is that people who need the subsidized housing are no longer able to get it because it's given all to the immigrants right now. And also on top of that, we even heard about how one guy who ended up crossing the border went to the hospital 2 days later, and it just so happened that he had cancer. It's like this guy clearly knew that he had cancer, But what he did is he decided he was going, when he heard about the loopholes at our border, he crossed the border and then he went to the hospital to get tested for it. And he knew that the cancer is going to be there. But then he was bumped to the top of the list for cancer treatment. So that way citizens who have actually need that, who pay for that service and require it, they're being pushed back more and more because of this situation there. And if we just keep, especially if we just don't do anything about our borders and we have people coming over wanting to use our medical system, we're going to end up doing what Brazil is going to do. Because right now, Brazil has been having its own problems. And there was a few months ago, I remember speaking to a woman from Brazil, and she was explaining everything that was going down. And one thing that ended up happening, she was talking about, was the fact that her 90-year-old father was suffering from the flu, if I remember correctly. Now, the flu is very dangerous to people who are very young, people who are very old. But when they go to the hospital, they're so overwhelmed, and a lot of it has to do with illegal immigration coming across the border. They're so overwhelmed that they are working on a red light, yellow light, green light system. So depending on how severe your malady is, they'll rate you based on that. And of course, red being the worst, green being the best. Well, not the best, but green being the least urgent. Her 90-year-old father, who has the flu, was considered at best a green to yellow. That's all he got. But and it's just because their medical system is so freaking bad right now. And that's even their private system that they're talking about, because they have both private and public. She was saying that the private coverage right now is as bad as the public one was 20 years ago. So it's just gotten downhill, very downhill. So, and you can imagine that by now the public coverage is no better. Like, it's just fucking shit. So these are the problems when you just allow people to come in and take advantage of the system itself. And we even heard how one guy who ended up crossing the border was a fucking pedophile. He was like a child molester or something, but he ended up getting across our border because we're really not doing anything in order to try and stop these people. And this is why so many people are starting to gravitate a lot more to Maxime Bernier, because he's talking about these situations, these problems, and it's something that Canadians are starting to feel. It's something that Canadians want people to address, but it's not being addressed by our regular politicians. So people feel it's time for a new party. It's time for a change, and that going along and voting with Conservatives right now and voting for Andrew Scheer is not good enough. And it's really not. I mean, I think a while ago I think it was on Twitter, I ended up putting out, it says, next election, do you want a gaping wound, which is Justin Trudeau, or do you want death from 1,000 cuts, which is Andrew Scheer? Andrew Scheer's policies are better and more moderate, but they're not much different and not much better. For instance, let's just say the NAFTA talks, for the sake of argument, goes into past the election in 2019. Andrew Scheer gets brought in. How is he going to do anything different that Justin Trudeau has already done? He supports supply management. He supports the counter tariffs against America when they implemented their tariffs on us. So it's not actually doing anything differently than what Justin Trudeau is doing now. And even when Andrew Scheer could stand up and take down Trudeau, he never did with certain things. When the whole incident with came out a couple of months ago about Trudeau and at the festival back in 2001, I think it was, when it came out that Justin Trudeau had groped a woman from the news. Andrew Scheer let that pass him by. All he pretty much said is, I'm going to let the public decide for themselves or whatever. But this is something he could have taken Trudeau down for. But none of that ended up happening. Instead, Scheer just ended up sort of saying meh to the whole thing. And a lot of people seem to think that this had to do with the fact that Andrew Scheer, he wants to go up against Trudeau in election because he doesn't really feel that he can beat somebody else. It has to be someone as ridiculous and disastrous as Trudeau. Although, if Trudeau was removed as the leader of the Liberal Party, because that's the one thing about Canadian politics, is that you can actually, removing the Prime Minister It's not that difficult. It's removing the party that's in charge that's really hard, because all the prime minister is head of the party that was elected into office. So if the Liberals wanted to right now, they could remove Justin Trudeau like that. They just need election. They would just have to vote on it. Now this would come from the Liberal Party itself. So if that happened, and then somebody else was voted as leader of the Liberal Party, which would essentially make that, not essentially, it would make them the next Prime Minister of Canada, there's really nobody else out there who could do a good job and not be just as ridiculous as Justin Trudeau. If we look at the lead people in his cabinet, Catherine McKenna, Ahmed Hussein, Bill Morneau, Chrystia Freeland, like, these the people who'd be the new prime minister. They wouldn't be fucking any better, so it would be fine. But a lot of people theorize that Scheer is aware of how mediocre he is, that he's aware that, you know, he doesn't really inspire a lot of confidence or leadership. And so because of it, he wants to go up against Justin Trudeau, because Justin Trudeau is just an absolute train wreck, so it'd be easy win for him. But my complaint has been for a long time is that Andrew Scheer, even when he gains in the polls, it's not because he's actually popular. It's not because people like Andrew Scheer and are gravitating towards the Conservatives. It's because Trudeau does something embarrassing and people lose support for Trudeau. But then they don't have any of the same inspiration from the NDP. So they end up going to, they gravitate more towards the Conservatives than Andrew Scheer. Scheer leads in the polls by default, not because he's earned that. And that's the difference between him and Maxime Bernier. Maxime Bernier actually does have popular support. He's a very popular MP. And I know that a lot of people, for instance, out in the West right now are very pissed off with the way things are going. And the idea of the Western provinces of Canada separating is rising sentiment again. But even in the West, it seems like Maxime Bernier is still a relatively popular member of Parliament, despite the fact he's from Quebec. In fact, despite the fact he's from Quebec, and I think he may have even talked about separation in the past for Quebec, despite this, he actually has been taking it to Quebec whenever he sees something that's not fair, something that doesn't go well with his policies, such as the equalization payments and supply management. Those are two things that would benefit the Quebec farmers, and it would benefit the equalization payments unfairly are beneficial to Quebec. But Maxime Bernier has actually spoken out against these things. So he's doing a lot better job than a lot of even some Albertan MPs out there right now. And it's going to be very interesting to see what ends up happening with this, because right now, Maxime Bernier is in open dialogue with the Libertarian Party of Canada about a possible merger between the two parties. Now, the Libertarian Party themselves are pretty insignificant in the past, but this is good to hear, because they did offer, actually, Maxime Bernier the leadership after he lost last year to Andrew Scheer in the Conservative leadership race. They did offer him the leadership of the Libertarian Party, but this would give him more resources and more people who can actually advocate for Maxime Bernier, and this would be awesome to see. Like, despite this, it would give him people who are involved in politics. It would give him people who, it would give him a little bit of more of a war chest, and he already himself has brought in like $100,000, despite the fact he doesn't even have a fucking party set up yet. It's awesome to see. Maxime Bernier has taken the Canadian political world by storm since the departure from the Conservative Party. Now he might be ready to drop another bombshell. Tim Moen, the leader of the Libertarian Party of Canada, has put the question of a potential party merger under the leadership of Maxime Bernier to party members. When addressing party members at a regional meeting in Red Deer, Alberta, Moen spoke of handing the reins over to Bernier if the members voted to do so. He quite clearly stated that he was happy to drop his personal political ambition for a unified Liberty vote. Quote, "We are having conversations with Max, and the question is going to be posed to the membership," end quote, said Tim Moen. So it'll be very interesting to see. And one thing I don't know yet, though, is would this be Maxime Bernier taking over the Libertarian Party, or would the Libertarians and Maxime Bernier merge together in order to form a new party? And I think that would probably be best if they merge to create a whole new party, because the Libertarians have been out there, haven't made an impact yet. And Maxime Bernier is a Libertarian party, libertarian, absolutely. But I find that I just think it would be better that if they could bring about a new party, which could actually probably draw more people in, especially because libertarian point of view is actually like a point of view and a political stance. So some people might be put off simply because it's the Libertarian Party. But if they were to rename as the Liberty Party or something like that, or the Freedom Party, just a few quick ideas, then I think that could actually work out well for Maxime Bernier and the rest of the libertarians out there. And it'd be very interesting to see that too. I mean, Maxime Bernier is very popular and he can bring in a lot of support for the party. He already is. And this is coming from all spectrums. This is coming, yes, most of it comes from conservatives, but these are liberal voters, NDP voters, and even a few Greens have actually expressed support in Maxime Bernier. So he's bringing a bunch of people over to his side right now. It's freaking fantastic to see. And in other news, while Maxime Bernier so far has been doing pretty damn well, things have been looking pretty stale and pretty unimpressive for the NDP right now. Ontario NDP facing harassment allegations, battles with unions. Some Ontario NDP MPPs are apparently finding it trying to work with staff represented by the big unions that typically back the party. Some Ontario NDP MPPs are apparently finding it trying to work with staff representing the big unions that typically back the party. The party terminated one employee and suspended the pay of two others ahead of the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal hearing concerning allegations of workplace misconduct filed against MPPs Paul Miller and Monique Taylor. COPE Ontario, the union representing NDP staffers, is calling out the Labour-friendly provincial party for failing to respect established labour disputes processes by terminating and suspending the employees ahead of scheduled hearings. Quote, "This is an all too typical employer attacks on workers' ability to use the grievance process to stop Employment Standards Act, labour law, and human rights violations. It's unacceptable from any employer, but it's appalling from the NDP," end quote, said COPE Ontario Director Patty Clancy. See, this actually just proves that the NDP are nothing like the type of people they try to present themselves as. They're nothing like the type of people that they say they represent. If they represent the workers, then why would they be exposing them to all sorts of this harassment? I mean, back last year during the college strike, Andrea Horwath was one who said that she would never, ever have signed back to work legislation, and she would have let the strike go on for however long it would have taken. This actually takes, this would have been terrible for for their younger vote, because a number of students would have been pissed off that nothing was being done about this strike at the time. But the whole idea is try and gain the support of the unions, which is really, they can't gain financial benefit from unions. That's actually not allowed in Canada. Neither is from money from corporations. But what they can do is that the unions can then rally their people in order to vote to a certain way. So they're trying to use these unions and the idea that they are for the worker in order just to gain more popularity, more votes. But as we can see, this is not at all like the type of people that the NDP actually are. In fact, they're really sneaky as well. I mean, this is, as we can see, your allegation of bullying, harassment, and unpaid work. I mean, hell, this is exactly the type of thing that the NDP rails against when it comes to private businesses, but they're no better. In fact, they sound like they're just as bad, if not worse, than that. And on top of that, the Ontario NDP is radical as hell. I ended up a little while before the Ontario election, I ended up covering this. It was also the Toronto Sun has covered this as well. So they're just absolutely terrible at sticking to their guns and being the people who actually are supposed to stand up for workers' rights. And in exchange for this, they accuse Doug Ford and the Conservatives of just supporting the businesses and supporting the rich 1%. which is kind of ironic because for the NDP supposedly being more socialist and Marxist, they themselves take their big paychecks and have no problem with it. I don't hear any of them that are giving theirs out to charity or saying that they'll take less so somebody else can take more. So this is the problem with when it comes to left-wing politics these days, is that they like to play the high ground. But when you play the high ground, it's a long way to fall down. I mean, this is the most recent one that they're facing harassment allegations and problems with the unions. But Andrea Horwath right now is actually being sued. Andrea Horwath is being sued $2.45 million for political hit job against former PC candidate. Roshan, who was was employed by the Toronto Police Service at the time, claims that the disinformation spread about him led him to quit his job at the police force and has damaged his reputation in the community and his quality of life. Ontario NDP leader Andrew Horwath is being sued by a former PC candidate for $2.45 million on charges of libel and defamation. Roshan Nalaratnam was a candidate for the Ontario Progressive Conservatives who narrowly lost the Scarborough-Guildwood riding in the last provincial election after an email surfaced allegedly containing threats made by Mr. Nalaratnam towards a voter. The NDP disseminated the email 3 days before the provincial election took place. Mr. Nalaratnam's lawyer, Ted Frankel, maintained that the email was created by a fake account claimed to be the affected candidate. Both the author of the email and the Liberal blogger are named in the lawsuit as well. And I don't think, do they have that email down here? Well, pretty much they were, the email itself was somebody asking him about, I believe it had to do with why he was involved in more debates, if I remember correctly. It was a while ago, so I might be remembering this a little wrong. But the main part of it was that, in response to this email, it was saying that this PC candidate, Roshan Nalaratnam, it ended up talking about how he ended up responding to them very threateningly and pretty much threatened violence against them. What was awesome, though, is that Candice Malcolm from the Toronto Sun, she ended up looking into this, and she was, I think she was the one who actually sort of figured this out, that it was a fake account that ended up talking about this, and I dug up her tweet from back in June. It says, she says, look at the extent the left is willing to go to smear Conservatives in Ontario. The NDP accused this PC candidate of sending this vile email. But look who the email address belongs to. The same person who received the email. Sent to me from a source, she says. So here we go. So as that was the response, it says, fucker, don't do nasty campaigns against me. I will teach you the lesson after election. So that was what was supposed to come from this gentleman. As we can see here, it was Alan Morica at yahoo.ca. Well, when you try the recovery email for that exact, for the one that it was sent for, R. Nalaratnam, the recovery email goes directly, okay, let me get that out of there. It goes directly to the same account that we received the email from, thus proving that it was a fake email address, and that was a fake email address, and that it was the same person trying to commit this. So it was literally this is them committing an act of slander or libel against him. And so it says that it was from as we can see here, the 30th of May, 2018, and this tweet was dug up at about, when was it? It was like the day before the election, I think. Yeah, it was June 6th, 2018 is when this came up. So it proved that it was a false document. So they deliberately did this in order to try and slander this conservative MPP, I guess, member of provincial parliament. So I think that Andrea Horwath and her NDP have every right to be sued over this. Absolutely. This is a disgusting thing to do, and it absolutely did destroy this guy's possibilities of becoming a member of parliament. And I had no idea until I read this article that this guy actually had to quit his job in the police force because of it. So in order to try and slander this guy in this riding, they kind of destroyed his life. So this lawsuit against the NDP is, to me, too sweet, just absolutely too sweet, because they have this coming, and this is Andrea Horwath, who's constantly calling Doug Ford a radical and associated with radicals, when she have overt Marxists in her party, people who think Chandra Pasma is one of the people who was running in a riding in Ottawa, and she ended up saying how jobs are not the solutions that people need. Yes, they are right now. That everyone is always looking for a job, but that shows how out of touch she is. We had another one who quoted Hitler. We had another one that was against the poppy and against the men and women in the armed forces. We have a bunch more that are against the police in general. It's absolutely terrible. Now, I love to see this because also on top of it, the NDP, at least at the federal level, are not doing well when it comes to funding right now. It was an article that was just released very recently. So, NDP MPs in mutinous mood over Jagmeet Singh's uninspiring leadership. Singh's biggest problem is, with the exception of rejecting Trans Mountain, his positions are indistinguishable from those of the most progressive PM in generations. Now, this was actually the Liberals' way of garnering more of the left-wing vote, as they outflanked the NDP on the left. But the other problem is that Singh has done absolutely nothing in order to gain himself support since he becomes the leader. He is still not sitting in the House of Commons. He has actually not run in a few different by-elections that he could run in order to get himself sitting in the House of Commons. But he hasn't even asked one question to the Prime Minister of Canada in the House of Commons. So this is a problem. His leadership, his support, hasn't changed since he became leader, and it's been almost a year now. It was about October or November of 2017 when he became the leader of the NDP, and he's done absolutely nothing so far. And they're not even sure. There's another by-election that's coming up that Singh can run in, and they're not even sure if if he can win that. The NDP has not gone anywhere since Singh has taken over. His whole idea is that he's going to pretty much be another Justin Trudeau. We don't need another Justin Trudeau when we have a Justin Trudeau already. So I ended up going over here. So their war chest for the NDP is they're losing money right now. And it says this, where is it? It says, financial results released this week from 2017 show the party at its lowest ebb in 16 years. A general election will cost $40 million, $20 million for the central campaign, $20 million for the ridings. And this is not a party that is raising anywhere near enough to fight a competitive campaign. The party's financial statement revealed negative net assets of $3.1 million. They lost $3 million. That doesn't include the Jack Layton building in downtown Ottawa, which the New Democrats could presumably remortgage to raise funds for a campaign, but it can only do that once. So if they don't end up getting more support, this is probably what they'll end up doing coming into the 2019 election, because it doesn't look like Singh's going anywhere. It doesn't look like he's getting any more support than they do now. So they're probably going to have to do this. But if they remortgage it and they lose out and they don't start bringing in more funds, they're probably screwed on that property. The problem is, or was in 2017, more money going out than coming in. Revenues were $5.9 million versus expenses of $7.2 million. There is next to no money in the bank, and the loss of the publicly funded per-vote subsidy, which used to bring in nearly $5 million a year, is still keenly felt. I actually really like this, that they've removed the per vote subsidy, because it was keeping certain people competitive that didn't deserve it. I mean, actually, this is pretty much what Kathleen Wynne did back about 6 months before the election or so. She ended up changing for the Ontario provincial election. She changed it so it's not, you don't really take in donations. You still can, but most of your money was coming from the government and you were being subsidized for how many votes you got. Now, to me, this seemed like an obvious attempt by Wynne in order to put herself in an advantage while giving everyone else a disadvantage, because she had she had the majority government, so she was. She would, and the Liberals would receive the most funding, and then would be the Conservatives, and then the NDP. But they're like, the Liberals got about $1 million more than the Conservatives did. But I'm guaranteeing you that if that was not in place and it was requiring on money coming in just from constituents, they would have never gotten anything close to that amount of money. I actually think that the Conservatives and Doug Ford could have very easily outfunded them very easily. So the fact that this was taken out, the per vote subsidy, as we can see, is she really hurting the federal NDP right now. In the wake of a disastrous by-election result in Quebec, Singh admitted, "It's clear we're not penetrating. We're not connecting with people. There's a very real prospect the NDP could be wiped out of a province where it held 58 of 75 seats after the Orange Crush election in 2011. Ouch. Ouch. Wiped out of the province from 58 seats back in 2011. That's nasty. That's a huge drop in support in less than 10 years. And it just shows how uninspiring that Jagmeet Singh is. I mean, so far, one of his main claims to fame is the fact that he taught some reporters how to fucking dance. And if you ended up seeing that, it was cringeworthy. He was like bringing them on stage and then teaching them how to dance, like Indian style, I guess. It was not very good. And then his other claim to fame is just the fact that he is the first turban-wearing party leader. Absolutely unimpressive. There are definitely others that could have done way better, in my opinion, in the House of Commons than he ever could. I mean, not someone like Nikki Ashton. Nikki Ashton was just, she was another cringeworthy, would have been another cringeworthy leader. But even she probably could have done a better job than Jagmeet Singh has done, and at least the other members who are running for the NDP leadership last year actually were members of parliament, so they could be in the House of Commons right now. But the NDP on the federal level have no leadership when it comes to the House of Commons, and Jagmeet Singh is more or less a junior rookie politician who ended up winning the leadership. So he doesn't really, in my opinion, know a lot about the subject. He doesn't know a lot about what he's talking about when it comes to politics. See, they should have chosen somebody with a lot more experience than Jagmeet Singh. And the only thing Jagmeet Singh can do is pretty much adopt what Justin Trudeau's policies are, even though Trudeau really stole it from the NDP. It's given the NDP nowhere to go when Trudeau did that, because Trudeau can fall back on some more liberal principles, or he can go even farther left to the more socialist principles. But the NDP are pretty much stuck in their socialist principles right now, and I actually think that this is why I've said in the past that they made a mistake by getting rid of Tom Mulcair. See, Tom Mulcair, when they did well, was when they were actually embracing a little bit more of they still stuck more to their guns about being more of a socialist party, but they did have a little bit more of a center-left approach. And this actually did well for Tom Mulcair for a while. It really did. And but ever since they've gone back to their more progressive, far lefty ways, ever since they lost the election, it has not gone well for the NDP. And like I've said before, Jagmeet Singh's biggest complaint against Justin Trudeau is that Justin Trudeau does not go far enough. Well, I think that's all I have for you all today on the podcast. I'm going to try and get my next episode of Know Your Owners out soon. I'm hoping to have it done within the next week or so. We'll end up seeing if that happens. I can't guarantee that. But the next one's coming up is about C.D. Jackson, so that one's going to be there's a lot of information there, and there's a lot of bombshells that I've come across while looking up C.D. Jackson. It's quite interesting. This C.D. Jackson was a member of. He was a advisor, if I remember my information correctly. He was an advisor for the Eisenhower administration. And he was also a member of the Psychological Warfare Department, and the stuff that went on in the Psychological Warfare Department is quite interesting. So hopefully I'll have that done for you guys in about a week, and then when I come back, I will have another episode of Know Your Owners for you, and I think this one's going to be even more interesting than the Bronfmans. Once again, anybody who, just once again to everybody, episode 79, which covered Know Your Owner, Samuel Bronfman, that has been blocked worldwide on YouTube. So you can go to my BitChute, which is still underneath Just My Stupid Opinion, and you can find it there. And the whole episode is there. So, because YouTube is constantly cracking down on people now these days. Well, anyway, thank you all for joining me on the podcast today. I'm Adrian Lloyd. This is Just My Stupid Opinion.